The SynchroMystic presents SynchroMystic. Let me just start off with a couple of news items that I found interesting. One major news item I'm reserving for a separate video, but in Popular Mechanics, I read a report that geological, quote, experts believe that a giant mass of hot rock known as the North Atlantic Anomaly is heading toward New York City. A new study suggests that this North Atlantic anomaly could have been responsible for the split between Canada and Greenland some 80 million years ago, on standard geological assumptions about the passage of time. Right now, this mass is, quote, 124 miles beneath the Appalachian Mountains in New England. However, it's supposedly moving toward New York City at, get this, the preposterously slow rate of 12 miles per 1 million years, meaning that it should arrive under the Big Apple in about 15 trillion years. So, obviously, the New York City angle isn't the real story. The big news seems to be the, quote, challenge posed to the long-held continental drift theory, first proposed by the German meteorologist Alfred Wegener in 1912. According to the theory, the continents we know today were once connected as one big supercontinent called Pangaea. The theory purports to explain why continental coasts align like puzzle pieces and why fossils from certain species are found in vastly different places. This drift, quote-unquote, was said to have started around 200 million years ago, a timeline that has been widely accepted as geological history for decades. But now an international research team may be challenging that notion with the new schema now called mantle wave theory, end quote. First of all, the giant mass of hot rock, the fear angle, the it's approaching New York City angle, all of those things that were in the lead. Those are interesting for the psychological effect that they might have on readers. From the standpoint of the geology, I'm mindful of Charles Fort, the contrarian, who talked about fossils and had a kind of a skeptical view of dinosaurs and this kind of thing, thinking that a lot of what was put forward as geological or Earth's past history, paleontology, and so on is suspect. So I don't draw any conclusions, just simply point you toward that article if you're interested. Here's a second news item. Since around 2006, aerospace behemoths Boeing and Lockheed Martin have been partnered in their so-called United Launch Alliance company. And on August 12th, media reports indicated that a rocket named the Vulcan blasted off from Cape Canaveral's Space Force Launch Complex number 41. It's being called the first national security space launch. Mum's the word on the specific mission parameters, but one article explains that past United Launch Alliance work has to do with the National Reconnaissance Office and, of course, the U.S. Space Force. Now, I find some of this interesting because I just have talked about Schriever Air Force Base and Peterson, what were once called Air Force bases that are now called Space Force bases. That's one reason. The idea of expanding the reconnaissance office and launching this new satellite has obvious importance for the panopticon or the surveillance state that is now obviously erected around us. It's hugely invasive and almost encompasses every aspect of our lives. The Cape Canaveral aspect is interesting. It harkens back to James Shelby Downard and the Sirius Rising recordings when he talked about how that used to be called Cape Kennedy. He talked about Jules Verne's book, The Trip to the Moon, references the Florida coast as being the place that one of the moonshots was directed from, and that was in the 19th century, so well before NASA. And the Vulcan name, also known as Hephaestus, the god of the forge, might find some interest there. And then from a crypto-political or crypto-economic aspect, I'm mindful of the fact that Boeing and Lockheed are both what Noam Chomsky has long referred to as recipients of welfare for the rich. They have all kinds of government contracts. Their research and development is government subsidized. And then this so-called private United Launch Alliance enterprise is now further making money for the both of them. And they're almost certainly hugely benefiting by tax dollars. And what do they do with it? They launch reconnaissance satellites to better monitor us. For all those reasons, I find these of interest, and I think you'll find the other news item of interest as well. But as I say, I am developing that in a standalone piece because I'm not so sure it's YouTube friendly, but I'm going to try it. So look for that soon. I often get really insightful or provocative comments on my posts and videos. And first of all, before I forget, thank you to everyone who does engage with the content. I really appreciate it. Honestly, whether the feedback is good or bad, quote unquote, but really I'm angling for critical in the good sense of engaging with the content, whether it's in agreement or disagreement, because polite disagreement can be very stimulating and I appreciate it. And so I just like to encourage more people, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum of reception, where they are in their thinking. If they're thinking about the issues that I present at all, I feel like that is something we have in common over people who don't think about these things at all. So that's my point of view. But recently, one viewer delivered several imaginative proposals to me, and they stimulated multiple rounds of reflection on my part. And what I thought I would do is share some of the thinking process I went through. And one personal reason is, frankly, that I found the ideas to be difficult. And even though I come down on the side of maybe what you might consider to be slightly against, just because of my difficulty in apprehending what was being proposed, I'm hoping that just the transparency here, which will follow, might spark additional conversation, whether from the original poster or from any other person who finds their interest gets sufficiently piqued throughout the presentation. So I'll give two reasons that I think it's important to tackle these kinds of hard questions and to frankly think hard about the issue. One definition of philosophy that I like a lot. It's an intuitive definition, sort of a folksy, rough and ready, get a quick fix on type definition, but it would be thinking deeply or thinking seriously about anything. Thinking seriously about fitness or about gardening or about baseball could count as philosophical thinking. And I think it's valuable. And one reason that I think it is valuable was expressed years ago by Michael Hoffman when he said something like that: our beliefs need to be tested in the crucible of open debate. So you could think that we have an individual duty, an epistemic duty, philosophically speaking, to hold beliefs that are properly grounded. And my training in philosophy has given me a lot of sympathy for this kind of an approach. I don't say that justification or warrant, as it's often called, is essential in every case, but it's certainly advantageous or desirous in most instances. Because as the philosopher John Hawthorne said in one lecture, I think available online, evidence can be thought of simply as a probability raiser. This is to say that when we believe a proposition, any proposition P, if we believe P for good reason, or on the basis of good evidence, that evidence raises the probability that the proposition P is true. And after all, it is something of an epistemic duty to believe as many true propositions as we can and to minimize any false propositions. We don't want to believe false propositions. We want to believe true ones. Now, on a popular wavelength, Noam Chomsky put his finger on one widespread problem. And I heard him say this in the Manufacturing Consent documentary. This was where a group of Canadian filmmakers just followed him around, and the entire video is like 3 hours long. But it's well worth watching, even if you only do it in 10 or 15 minute intervals and it takes you a while to get through it. But at one point, he was asked something like, why isn't he invited on primetime news shows or something? And as part of his answer, all of the answer is worth listening to, but part of his answer, the part that I'm going to be focused on, he says something like that: people don't require you to give evidence if all you're doing is regurgitating widely accepted opinions. No one requires evidence on a popular level. They should require evidence for most of what people believe, or at least it would be, once again, desirous. I don't want to fall into evidentialism, strictly so-called. At the same time, I don't want to use the fact that I'm not a full-throated evidentialist as an excuse for just sort of saying, you don't need evidence, you can just fly by the seat of your pants. No. But Chomsky went on to say, if you say anything the least bit surprising, then all of a sudden people require you to have evidence. And this isn't a bad thing, but I would say that is precisely why we need to concern ourselves with careful thinking and with evidence, especially in cases of controversy. And a lot of what I get into in the channel, SynchroMysticism, Synchronicity, theological topics, various philosophical topics, especially ones that get into metaphysics. These are all sort of verboten to Enlightenment types, modernist types, even though we're in arguably a post-modern environment in a lot of ways. Some of these topics are once again permissible to raise and talk about. We want to be careful in the way we formulate not only the questions we ask, because the way in which we get answers is going to partially depend on how carefully we formulate our questions, but I think we also want to be careful how we formulate our answers, because people are listening and they make judgments about how reasonable a person they think you are or how careful a thinker they believe you to be based on the claims that you make. And in many cases, this is difficult to get a fix on. If you can tolerate me being a bit philosophical for a few more minutes here, when you think of a belief, let's call it B, so some belief B, and I tell you I believe B, and you say, well, why in the world would you believe something like that? And then let's suppose that I've done my epistemic due diligence, and so I have some answer to that question. And for the time being, let's just say whatever I say in answer to that question is my evidence, and let's call that E. So you ask me, why in the world do you believe B? And I say, E. This is why I believe B. Now, in principle, this gives you an entree into understanding my thought process. And it also gives you some place to bear down, because if you can follow my train of thought and you understand E, let's say, what I offer as evidence, then you've got a basis for either accepting B or rejecting B and saying to me, you know what, you said your evidence was E, but I don't think that E actually entails B, and here's the reason why, or I think E is false, or I think you're misinformed, or whatever. But instead of just saying, oh, you believe B, I don't believe that at all, we actually can get into a conversation. Now, here's the problem. Let's suppose that I give you some belief. I say, I believe in some arcane thing, whatever it is. And then as my evidence, I say, well, it's quantum mechanics, or it's relativity theory. And I make some hand-waving remark to some complicated tapestry, some scientific theory, or just something that is not easy for people to get a handle on. One way of thinking about that is that I really do understand quantum mechanics, and I really do think that if you understood it as well, you'd believe some further thing. That's possible. But it's also possible that I'm misinformed about it, or that it's more or less just a hope that, well, quantum mechanics is sort of mystifying, and here I am holding this other mystical belief over here, so let's yada yada. Maybe quantum mechanics is support for this further belief. This is a real concern to me, because when I read something like Rhonda Byrne's The Secret, I get the distinct impression that she, and perhaps some of the people that contributed interview text, have that kind of a confusion, that they either don't understand the theories that they're making a reference to, or that they're sort of grasping at them simply because they seem to be mystifying things. They're just like, no one understands quantum mechanics, so for all we know, quantum mechanics does justify, for instance, the law of attraction or positive thinking or something like that. But as I tried to unpack in the time relations piece, which is on Substack, and which I just released, I think, on YouTube. In this case, it was relativity theory that I was bearing down on most directly. But Rhonda Byrne and a number of her contributors basically assert that Einstein can be summoned as support for this sort of law of attraction idea. And as I explained, and I'm not going to do it now, I'm not going to rehearse it now, but as I explained, I think that she's just wrong, Byrne, in her summary of what she takes relativity theory to be, to imply, what she claims Einstein taught. I think she's just wrong. Now, that doesn't show that the law of attraction is false. If she says to me, I believe the law of attraction, and I say, well, why would you believe that? And she says, well, here are 3 pieces of evidence, E1, E2, and E3. And I go through and try to determine what I think about her evidence, and I conclude that E1, E2, and E3 are all false, or that she has misunderstood her evidence, then I no longer have any evidence for believing in the law of attraction. That doesn't mean that it's false. That just means that I don't have good reason for embracing it. She hasn't given me any good reason, because all of the reasons that she did give, and here I'm using reason and evidence as synonyms, all the evidence that she gave me turned out to not actually support the belief in question. But again, I think that when we are trying to deal seriously with issues like synchronicity and SynchroMysticism, I mean, these are very difficult subjects for people to get a grasp on. And if we find somebody who's sort of on the fence, I mean, there's going to be some people who just completely reject it. This is a concept that I actually learned when I was in sales. And they were talking about, I think the specific topic was extended warranty sales. I was working at Circuit City. And the presenter said something like, I'm probably misremembering the percentage, but it was something like 20% of people will never buy an extended warranty, ever. Doesn't matter what you say, they're simply not going to buy it. 20% of people will always buy it, no matter what you say. In fact, they may even ask for it if you don't offer it. And again, some of these percentages might be high or low or whatever. The idea was those are 40% that just comes right off the top that you can't do anything with. But then it was the remaining 60% that were supposed to be the skilled salesperson's real fertile ground. You were a good salesperson if you could convert a good portion of those 60%, because you're not a good salesperson if you've got one of the 20% that would always buy. And it's no knock against your sales prowess, say, if you're encountering one of the 20% who would never buy no matter what. But now, in a similar way, there could be people who would just never believe any kind of synchronicity or SynchroMysticism. They'll never believe it no matter what. And then there are some people who will believe it no matter what. Well, I don't consider myself in either of those two camps. Obviously, I'm not in the former camp of disbelieving it no matter what. I don't consider myself in the camp of people who would believe it no matter what. I think I believe it because there's good evidence for it. And this is very important to me. And so it's important to me to be clear in the way that I express when I'm explaining what synchronicity is. It's important to me to be clear when I'm trying to list off pieces of evidence that I take to be good evidence for it. And it's important to me to not make hand-waving remarks toward things like quantum theory or relativity or anything that might be mystifying, or frankly, where it might turn out that I'm just wrong because I don't understand what I'm gesturing toward.
There's the famous anecdote attributed to astrophysicist Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington, the guy who's known for, among other things, articulating the concept of the arrow of time, that is, time's apparent unidirectional flow. And this is a puzzle, by the way, if time is construed as a so-called fourth dimension, because in the case of the other three spatial dimensions that we're familiar with, length, width, and height, you can move back and forth along the dimensions at will, but you can't do that with time. So time has this directionality to it that if it is one of the dimensions, is quite puzzling, especially. In any case, the story goes that Eddington was asked whether it was really true that only 3 people in the world understand the theory of general relativity. And presumably, the questioner was thinking of Eddington himself, along with the theory's articulator, Albert Einstein. And Eddington supposedly responded, 3 people? Really? Who's the third? So, bit of a joke. Of course, in time relations, we talk quite a lot about Hermann Minkowski, who is credited with articulating the concept of Minkowski space. And then we also get into Grunbaum. So anyway, but in the case of quantum mechanics, things are arguably even murkier. The one-time, almost celebrity-level theoretical physicist Richard Phillips Feynman once remarked, quote, "I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics," end quote. Now, this is quite a statement from a guy who basically apprenticed at the Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico, rubbing elbows with the likes of J. Robert Oppenheimer and Edward Teller, and working on developing the first atomic bombs. Of course, I think we have to differentiate between the machinery of quantum theory, which is, of course, a mathematical model, and interpretations of quantum theory, which attempt to translate the math into everyday English and to provide a picture of the world that is implied by the math. So, mathematically, quantum theory is, or at any rate has been called, one of, if not the most confirmed and quote-unquote successful scientific theories ever articulated. But this is at the level of probability. In other words, it's very successful as a mathematical model of the world in the sphere of reality that it is directed toward. So, microscopic reality, the quantum realm. But at the level of interpretation, it's quite another matter. This is where you get all manner of speculation. Some of that speculation is propounded by interpreters who have little to no comprehension of the math, and I think that's part of what Feynman is talking about when he made the remark, which, by the way, was in 1964 at Cornell University, which I just mentioned as a kind of a tangent in the vicinity of ciphers, Mr. Ezra Cornell, and the Western Union Company in the video that I did on numerology. At the level of popular interpreters, Rhonda Byrne and her coterie of participants in The Secret and The Power and her other follow-up volumes, they would count. But at the level of academic and professional scientist, Niels Bohr has a famous interpretation of quantum mechanics called the Copenhagen interpretation. There's the many worlds interpretation by Hugh Everett, which we got into in the time relations piece. A guy by the name of David Bohm got his interpretation, which is quite interesting, but we didn't touch on, and many, many others. There are books that have been written on this, of course, so it's a very tangled web. These are very arcane physical theories, and I don't pretend to have plumbed the depths. I spent a good part of time relations in the beginning trying to explain or trying to tease out a parallel between what I was doing and artistic schools like Impressionism and Surrealism. They represent reality. It's an impression. It is not realism. So that was a caveat that was hung on the time relations piece. But at the same time, I did use some of the philosophical background that I had, particularly in understanding or trying to understand various philosophical theories of time like presentism and eternalism, and I was able to use that to try to get some insight, and I hope that I was able to accomplish that. But my antennae go up when something comes across my radar that I think might tend toward the more mystifying if I don't find it helpful. What I'm going to offer now might be construed as a little bit of criticism. The purpose is you can get a handle on it by thinking of the idiom that a rising tide lifts all ships. Now, I realize this evidently came out of economics. It's debatable whether or not economics actually supports that metaphor. But nevertheless, I'd like to think that if we can help one another to think as carefully and clearly as possible, that if we can do that, in doing so, we can bring benefit to basically everybody around us, everybody in our circle, everybody we have access to. So whereas I think that we have an individual epistemic duty to try to concern ourselves with our own evidence, I actually think also we have a social duty to others around us to present the best case that we can for things that we think are true. Now, of course, some things are just trivial, so they're not worth the time to debate or discuss. But in other cases, I think this is not the case. And synchronicity might not be maybe as obviously important as where you're going to get your clean water tomorrow, but I think it's an important issue. I think it deals with the way reality actually is, and I think we should be as careful as we can in thinking about it, and also related issues. So, okay, that's the reason, and I gave that very long-winded introduction here for the reason that I don't want to be misconstrued as attacking or doing anything like that. I'm very much keen to enter into the highest level discussion with people as we possibly can, and I think it's going to be a credit to the things that we believe if we can think seriously about them. And contrary-wise, I think it would be a public relations disaster for us to sort of be sloppy in our thinking, because then those 60% of people who might be on the fence about the topics that we get into are just going to be put off, or potentially would be put off, because they're not going to be satisfied that we're serious, that we are academically or intellectually honest is maybe the best way to say it. That's the goal, to try to be as intellectually honest and as rigorous as we can be. So, okay, now on to the comments. I'm going to leave the full text of the initial comment on the screen, and anybody can read it if they would like. But I also am going to read I'll call it a rephrasing, and it goes as follows. The commenter says, "What I call event space is a timeless series of events. It becomes apparent, this timeless series of events, when one considers various supernatural or retroactive changes to the actual timeline, where the establishment's historical record indicates something contrary to what we know actually happened. Though, of course, it did happen. This phenomenon, where our true memories overrule the timeline, further reveals that the soul or mind is separate from time, since we are able to remember things as they actually happen, even though many of them are now said never to have happened. Most people, however, disappointingly take the update, that is to say,
they comport themselves to the establishment's historical record of the timeline instead of relying on their own memory. There are innumerable Mandela changes. Isaiah used to say, "The lion shall lie down with the lamb," but now it is said to always have been, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb." And with event space, I'm talking about the dimensionless series of occurrences that exists independently of time. Though the timeline may change and indicate a different past, all of what actually has happened is unchanged. Indeed, the timeline itself exists in the ledger of occurrences. Now, my rephrasing was for my own comprehension. It's possible that I have phrased something in such a way as to change the commenter's original intention, but the changes that I just read to you are the ones that I performed in order to try to get a handle on what was said, so I'm going to go by my reconstruction. But as I say, the original is there for your inspection. Now, if I just summarize some of this in light of what I previously was talking about belief and evidence, then I would say it seems like the commenter is saying his stated belief is that there exists something called event space, and that thing does two things, or it has two important characteristics. Firstly, event space is an objective ledger of actual occurrences, as distinct from the establishment's historical record, at least what I'm calling the establishment's historical record. And this latter record, establishment historians frequently alter, but event space infallibly tracks even these corruptions, fabrications, or other modifications. Secondly, event space shows that the solar mind is timeless. Now, how does it do that? Well, it seems to be because of the following. Number one, the commenter distinguishes between a dimensionless series of occurrences and whatever exists in time. Number two, the commenter appears to equate history and time. And number three, the commenter evidently understands alterations to what I'm calling the establishment historical record to be tantamount to alterations to time itself. And somehow each person has a choice as to whether or not he or she takes the update. That is to say, whether or not they accept falsified history or they retain their true memories. And the evidence supplied for this seems to be basically, quote, innumerable Mandela changes. So I want to get into a couple of points a little more deeply, namely the idea of a dimensionless series and these important Mandela changes. But before that, let me just say, I do think it's a provocative set of ideas. Certainly, I spent some time thinking about them, so I can't be accused, I hope, of thinking that any of this is a waste of time, because I've spent considerable time thinking about it. Where I'm standing right now, just to let you know what I'm thinking about, I am having trouble getting my mind around the suggestions. And I'll give you a few basic reasons before I get into the details of those 2 points that I just named. The first thing is, it seems to me that in the case of this proposed infallible and objective ledger, event space, that this is a surrogate for the infallible memory of God, or a surrogate for God's omniscience, or something like that. Now, that means it's similar then, perhaps, to what the British philosopher G.E. Moore once posited when he talked about non-natural properties. For example, goodness, he thought, was a non-natural property. It just exists. And this is what grounds moral judgments, moral values, and this kind of thing, even though Moore was a professed atheist or agnostic or something. He was kind of like Bertrand Russell in this way. For Moore, these non-natural properties like goodness are supposed to do the work that a Platonist would assign to abstract objects, or that some theists would assign to God's nature. So if a theist says, well, moral values are grounded in God's nature, Moore says, no, it's not like that because there is no God, but moral values are grounded in just this property of goodness. So just like we have a property of redness, or a property of softness, or a property of bigness and smallness, we have a property of goodness, and that does all the work that we would require. So to this extent, event space seems like it's one way to track history objectively without appealing to God as an infallible observer. I feel much more comfortable situating this postulated infallible and objective ledger within the mind of God. So I think what the commenter is describing is more naturally thought of as God's point of view, or a God's eye point of view. In other words, I'd say that God infallibly knows what actually happened in history and in time. God knows that. Moreover, I'm having a little bit of a problem also distinguishing between the record of time and the ledger of time. And it seems to me that the record and the series both require time, so that neither is timeless, essentially. And I'll get a little bit more into that when I talk about what I think about this idea of a dimensionless series in a minute. But furthermore, in my view, we need to carefully distinguish metaphysical questions from epistemological ones. What actually happened in history is, by my lights, a metaphysical question. How we know about what happened, or where we get our information about history, or what historians say about what happened, these are all epistemological questions, and we shouldn't confuse the two. So I'm personally not much tempted at all to say that falsification of the historical record is the same thing as tampering with time itself. I would say, no, this is not the case. And an example would be the infamous stories about former Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin falsifying encyclopedia entries and other historical texts as a key part of his propaganda and purges. Google gives the case of ex-secret police head Lavrenti Beria. Beria had been one of Stalin's close associates. But after Beria's arrest and execution in 1953, Stalin ordered Beria's biographical entry to be removed from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. Now, on my view, the correct description of this case is as follows. Beria actually existed, and he actually was a close associate of Stalin, and he actually was the head of the Soviet secret police. Stalin, for his own propagandistic purposes, denied this and falsified these facts after Beria was executed. But when we say that Stalin or his minions rewrote history, what we mean is that they falsified historical books. They falsified the record of history. They falsified what was said about history. We do not mean, or at least I don't, that Stalin or his minions managed to erase Beria from time itself, or that they managed to alter history itself. No, they simply altered what is said about history. Now, granted, there are access problems. For example, if the story of what we tell about history is changed, that might prevent some people from actually getting at the objective truth. But I think it would be a mistake to conflate the two. What actually happens is one thing, and we may be able to know that, and we may not. And what we say about what happened is another thing. And we can lie, or we can tell the truth, or I should say we can be honest about what we think happened, or we could lie. But what we say about what happened is not the same thing, by my lights anyway, as what actually happened. But now, that's my general view. Let's go on to those two specific things that I named. So just to start off, I'm having a problem understanding what the commenter is actually getting at. And I'd like to use two portions of the comment as an illustration to kind of give you insight into the way that I think, in the hopes that maybe we can understand each other better, or you can understand my content better. And of course, leave it open if you disagree with me. Please feel free to comment, to email me at thesynchromistic@gmail.com, or however you want to convey your thoughts to me. Feel free to do that. I'm not going to go through this word by word or idea by idea, but I'd like to simply comment on two specific things that stood out to me. And they're places where I'm not so sure I understand what is being proposed. So the first place is this idea of a dimensionless series. What I would say is, in the time relations piece, I mentioned the fact that dimensionality is importantly related to coordinate systems. So, for example, if you can identify the location of something based on two coordinates, as you can in a Cartesian graph, then you're dealing with a two-dimensional system. Two coordinates, two dimensions, x and y, as is the case with the Cartesian coordinate system, what you'd plot on standard graph paper. If you need three coordinates, as we tend to think we do in the physical world, my example in the time relations piece was the treasure on Oak Island, or the treasure supposed to be on Oak Island, that if we wanted to dig up that treasure and we had an actual location, we would need more than just latitude and longitude. We would also need an altitude or a depth. And that's because in order to find something in physical space, we need to know where it is in terms of the length, the width, and the depth. We have three physical dimensions, and that means we need three coordinates to find something in physical space. Now that means if something is dimensionless, then either there is simply no way to differentiate elements, quote unquote, or we're talking about having zero coordinates. And this is a bit of a difficult thing for me to get my mind around what's being proposed. To give you an idea as to what I'm thinking of, you could think of a number line versus a point. Geometrically, a point is defined as dimensionless. Of course, when we represent a point, we have to draw it, and no matter how small you draw it, it is going to have some length and width on the page, and also some depth, because if you use a pencil, for instance, the graphite is going to leave some kind of impression. It's not dimensionless when we represent it, but in thought, conceptually, a point is dimensionless. Now, what this means is that there is no variation within the point. It's not like we can say, well, the upper part of the point or the lower part. There's no part. It's dimensionless. There's nothing to divide up if something is dimensionless. We can contrast that with a line, which geometrically is supposed to have one dimension. The way that we differentiate locations on the number line is by simply specifying one coordinate, namely the number in question. So let's just suppose we're thinking about counting numbers. So we'll go from, let's say, 0 all the way out to positive infinity in principle. We can specify the number 3. Okay, well, that is on the number line. And where it is, we can find. And all we need is to know the number 3. We just need one number in order to specify its location. And this tells us that it's got one dimension. The number line is straightforwardly a series. We have a series of numbers going from, let's suppose, 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to positive infinity. Now, just to drive the point home, if it is a bit unclear, if we have a series, then we have to have dimension in order to specify the elements in the series. In my example, the line in question is a series of numbers because each number occupies a different place, quote unquote, on the number line. And we can specify each number's individual place by representing it, and the coordinate just would be the number in question. But that ability to specify elements and indicate their individual locations and differentiate that location from every other member's location. So 2 and 3 do not occupy the same spot on the number line because they're not the same number. They don't have the same coordinate. But that is what makes the number line a series. And going along with it being a series, it is at least one-dimensional, because if it weren't, we wouldn't be able to indicate the elements of the series. Now, that means that if there is a dimensionless series, all of the members of that series would essentially be indistinguishable, at least from the level of their coordinate, because there would be no coordinates, just like in a point. There'd be an undifferentiated mass. The nearest thing I can get to this when I think about it is something called the null set. And in philosophy of language, there are several puzzles about reference. I don't want to get too far into this, but just to give you a quick fix, you can think of something like, let's say, my name is Matt. On Bertrand Russell's view of propositions, if you say, Matt is the SynchroMystic. On Bertrand Russell's view of propositions, I, flesh and blood me, am a constituent of that proposition. And so the reference for Matt in that is me, flesh and blood person. But if you were to talk instead about Sherlock Holmes, the famous fictional detective created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the question becomes, what is the referent? And on one view, this is a real puzzle for reference because there doesn't appear to be any flesh and blood reference for Sherlock Holmes. Of course, there are actors who have portrayed Sherlock Holmes, Basil Rathbone, Jeremy Brett, Benedict Cumberbatch. But in this case, this doesn't help us much because if we're trying to refer to Sherlock Holmes and it refers to all of those or every actor, then we have difficulty in distinguishing what we're referring to. So on one view, not necessarily the most popular view, Sherlock Holmes refers, strictly speaking, to the null set. That is to say, it is a set with no members. But if that's true, and if that's the view that you hold, then other characters like Pegasus or unicorns that on at least the received view would not have reference either, they would all be the null set. But then that would mean that in a strict sense, Sherlock Holmes is identical to a unicorn, or Sherlock Holmes is identical to Pegasus, because they're undifferentiable. So this appeal to the null set runs into difficulties on this view in philosophy of language because there isn't a way of differentiating members. And it does seem, at least intuitively, pre-philosophically, philosophically, when we think about it, it seems that Sherlock Holmes is different from a unicorn. So if our analysis suggests that they're actually the same, even if they're both the same because they're nothing, that just doesn't seem like a satisfying analysis. And even though I don't get the impression that this idea of a dimensionless series is precisely the same thing as a null set, I'm getting kind of null set vibes from it. And for the reason that I gave, I'm not so sure I can make sense of what it would mean to be a dimensionless series. On my reading of that anyway, or my understanding of what it would be to have dimension and my understanding of what it would mean to be a series, dimensionless series would be verging on a contradiction. It would be like saying a series-less series or a dimensionless dimension, which I really can't get my mind around. Now, the second place I want to bear down is on this appeal to the Mandela effect or to Mandela cases. This is why I made those prefatory remarks about quantum theory and about relativity theory. And what I had in mind there primarily is something like this. I'm open to the idea that received views are wrong. There's a ton of received views that I think are problematic. And I don't think that relativity theory is immune from criticism. One criticism that I take very seriously, in fact, is that Einstein was operating under the influence of people like Ernst Mach, that he was influenced by positivism, that he defined relativity theory in reference to the speed of light because he discounts the idea of unobservable entities, and therefore the measurement of the speed of light is the bedrock of the theory because he is a positivist. It's interesting to note that this theory of relativity in both its general and special formulations is based philosophically on an epistemology, namely positivism, that is no longer widely held. In fact, that is widely rejected. And there aren't a whole lot of people who seem to be working on the problem of where that leaves a person in relation to relativity theory. But the point is, it's one thing to take the theory as it is and then say, I'm going to critique it. And here's the basis for the critique. It's that it's based on positivism, and positivism is now passé. That's a critique. You have to take the theory as it is in order to critique it. So now, the Mandela effect, as I understand it, the received view, the dictionary definition, if you like, is that the Mandela effect is a reference to a phenomenon where a large group of people share a false memory of an event or a detail, often believing it to be true, despite it not being the actual reality. And of course, I'm reading from the Google AI here. It's a collective misremembering of something. And then they give numerous examples of this. It'd be interesting maybe to list a few of them here in a second. The first thing I want to note is that the Mandela effect assumes that there is an objective fact about the way the world is, because a person cannot be said to misremember something unless there is a correct way to remember it. So, for instance, one of the examples it says here is misremembering Darth Vader's line as Luke, I am your father, when the actual line is no, I am your father. Or the idea that Mandela himself, Nelson Mandela, died in prison in the 1980s under apartheid, when in fact he survived and became president of South Africa. But the point is that in order for there to be anything that answers to the description Mandela effect, there has to be a correct way the world is. So in the actual world, Darth Vader in the movie Empire Strikes Back says, quote, no, I am your father, end quote. And if someone else comes along and says, Darth Vader actually said, Luke, I am your father, they are wrong. And that's an important thing. It's not that there are two different alternative realities, one in which the line was legitimately, Luke, I am your father, and another in which it is, no, I am your father, and we're not sure which reality we're in, or that we're crossing between realities, or that some people were in one reality and others are in another. No, the definition of the Mandela effect is that the people who say the line was, Luke, I am your father, are just wrong. They're mistaken. They're misremembering. In order for there to be a Mandela effect, there has to be an objective fact of the matter, is I guess what I would say. And so any appeal to the Mandela effect that doesn't result in a conviction that there is an objective fact of the matter about the world is going to have to explain what is meant by the Mandela effect, because evidently the way that it's being used in the comment is not the way that it's being used in the received description of it that I just read and that was in my head before I even looked it up. Again, the way that it's looked up could be wrong. So I'm not saying Google is infallible, so don't misunderstand me. There are plenty of things that if I were to look them up, I would disagree with the presentation that Google gives or that other people give. But at least what I would have to do in a case where I disagree is to say, here's where they go wrong. And I think I would be prepared to do that. I don't really want to get too deep into examples of that, but one, for example, that just comes up, I just watched a video where the person was talking about Benjamin Franklin, and they were saying Benjamin Franklin was clear in his conscience because he was such a virtuous man, and he wrote in his Poor Richard's Almanac and other places, he has these proverbs for how to live correctly, and so he advocates that you don't clutter up your mind with things like guilt and so on because they impede your ability to be a polymath. The explanation for how Benjamin Franklin was able to live virtuously was that he was actually taking his precepts seriously. He would live by them and articulate rules for life, and he stuck by that. However, if you've seen some of the videos that we've done, for instance, 10 Occultist Spies, and I actually drew out the portion on Benjamin Franklin and published that separately in a slightly edited version, you know that we believe that a good case can be made, I think, that Benjamin Franklin was actually a Luciferian bordering on an out-and-out Satanist. He was a member of Sir Francis Dashwood's Hellfire Club. According to the Professor Cecil Curry, a good case can be made that Benjamin Franklin was an actual spy during the Revolutionary War and was not a patriot in the sort of sense that we would assume, that in fact his old house in London was discovered to have bodies buried inside of it, and then this was blamed on some house guest that he had that was supposedly running an anatomy school in Benjamin Franklin's house, and it had nothing to do with Franklin. But in the video we argue that maybe that's not exactly the case, and I seem to recall in an old audio recording from Michael Hoffman that Hoffman mentioned that there were allegations against Franklin for some sinister stuff going all the way back to the early days of the Republic. I didn't include that in the video because I couldn't locate the recording, but I may as well just mention it. So in other words, you can make those cases. Now, how then could you explain how Benjamin Franklin was such a successful polymath if he had all of these things on his conscience, if he had all these sins on his soul? And one explanation is that I'm just wrong and that he was really a saint. But another is that he was some kind of a sociopath, to use the modern psychological lingo, or if you don't like that lingo, and I certainly don't, that he just did not care that the things he did were considered to be wrong. And you could fill in the blank with any number of kinds of philosophical ideas. Friedrich Nietzsche later developed his idea of the Superman, later obviously than Franklin. But if Franklin was on some kind of a proto-Nietzschean wavelength, he might have simply thought, look, I'm better than most people, smarter than most people, I have prerogatives that other people don't have. If you watched, I think it was that 10 Occultist Spy video, that I toy with the idea in that the cremation of care ceremony that's affiliated with the Bohemian Grove has a similar kind of a flavor to it. That cremation of care on the surface just means cast your cares aside and come here and let's be frivolous. But on the other hand, it can mean let's actually cremate your conscience. Let's sear your conscience so that the things that you're going to have to do as a decision maker or a person of influence in the United States, that these things don't bother your conscience. And that's the explanation that I would tend to favor. I don't say that I'm conclusive about it, but I just gave you an example of how it would be somebody's view about Franklin. I take it as it is, and I say, I understand your view, I understand your evidence, and then it's my job, then, if I'm going to advance an alternative view, it's my job to take those pieces of evidence, to address them seriously, and then put in their place an alternative set of evidence for the different picture that I'm supposing. And I would take that seriously. And again, if somebody wants to do that for the Mandela effect, I'd be open to hearing the case. It's not persuasive to me to just go, well, the Mandela effect is actually talking about possible worlds or different universes, the multiverse, that when somebody is sure, quote unquote, that the line was, Luke, I am your father, that's because in their universe, that's what it was. And then somehow they ended up in our universe. Well, maybe. I mean, I don't want to rule that out. I'm, an open-minded kind of guy. I'm on the synchromystical wavelength. If somebody wants to argue that, I'd be open to hearing the case. But it would require an explanatory apparatus for, first of all, grounding. Why should we think there are these multiple universes in the first place? And secondly, how can people travel between them? And then thirdly, how then do we define the Mandela effect and give me necessary and sufficient conditions for what would constitute an example of the Mandela effect? So anyway, I appreciate all comments. I really do. And in this case, the reason why I decided to go a little bit further and to try to draw some of these issues out is to really just sort of try to give you insight into the way my mind, maybe you're horrified, but the point is I really do think that if we can be careful about the way we think, it's going to benefit the project of trying to understand what synchronicity and synchromysticism comes to, and it's going to benefit any of us who are interested in trying to discuss these issues with friends, with associates, co-workers, around the dinner table, around Thanksgiving table, and it's going to give you a way in which I think you can be confident that the belief you hold in these things is reasonable, and it's going to essentially equip you to build a case for it. But I think we would err quite severely, or if you prefer that pronunciation, we would make an error if we just sort of jumped too quickly, or if we make hand-waving comments and we try to just be to harken back to the language and time relations. If we're too impressionistic or too surrealistic, then what we're saying comes across somewhere between fabulous, make-believe, or delusion, or it comes across just as misunderstanding, hand-waving, we don't really know what we're talking about, we're being sloppy in our thinking and that kind of thing. So anyway, I welcome any kind of response that's civil, and I don't want the commenter, I don't want anybody listening to think that I'm being attacking in any way. What I'm confessing here is that I can't get my mind around what's being discussed. And once again, please feel free to give me an email or a comment. My email address is thesynchroMystic@gmail.com, or you can just drop a comment, as they say, in the area below the video or off to the side or wherever it is on your device. And thanks for thinking about these issues with me. Thanks to all who watch, and for anybody who wants to comment. By the way, I did ask the commenter if they would mind if I reacted in a video, so hopefully they're not ruining the day that they gave me that permission. But if you would like to have me answer something or just react to something that's on your mind, just feel free to let me know that as well. And hope to see you guys again in another video. Okay, thanks so much.